Okay, today we're going to be looking at the plateau in A Thousand Plateaus, titled On Several Regimes of Signs, and we're going to be looking at what Deleuze and Guattari have to say about subjectification and regimes of signs. We're going to be looking at two diagrams that they have here in the plateau, or the chapter, and I'm going to kind of be explaining them. It shouldn't be too long, and I'm also going to connect this to one of the diagrams, one of the few, maybe the only diagram in Anti-Oedipus, to help explain what exactly Deleuze and Guattari are so worried about with the development of territory. If you've stumbled upon Deleuze and Guattari and are maybe a little bit confused, what are they all in a tizzy about? They're very wary of the idea of codified systems of signifiance, for example, such as Oedipus or the phallus. The idea that we can interpret a dream and we can impose upon that dream the interpretive schema of the signifier, that is Oedipus, and we can overcode the content of the dream, so to speak, such that it is interpreted through the hermeneutic of Oedipus, for example. And in, for example, the second plateau on One or Several Wolves, they critique this for taking a dream that potentially has a number of different ways in which it connects to other assemblages in real life, and maybe what it is trying to say. They want to say that the way that we figure out what the dream, quote-unquote, really means, if we can even use that term, is not necessarily to impose some structural order, but rather to see exactly what kind of lines of flight is this drawing? In what ways is this displaying rhizomaticism? So here in the plateau, they give us this strange little diagram, and we have to contextualize this a little bit by saying that they're talking about exactly how is it that we have these codified state formations and systems that appear. How is it that we can develop complex social situations where we have social norms like how you should dress and how you should speak? How is it that we come up with agreed upon systems of action? How is it that we decide on a way collectively in which we are able to express ourselves? And Deleuze and Guattari want to be a little bit cynical about this and say that, in fact, it is not a democratic endeavor. If we look at the way in which territory is developed, and for them, territory is really the codification of a formal system, we see that it is imposed from the top down, so to speak. It is an imposed hierarchical order, which is meant to benefit those at the top of that hierarchy. They're very similar to Foucault in this way, and I'm not going to touch on their comments on Foucault they make later in the chapter, but it is important to note that they are connecting this work to Foucault's work, and for Foucault, he is trying to explain how exactly it is that knowledge, things like scientific knowledge, are structured, in fact, by power imbalances and power systems. How is it that what it means to be guilty, for example, or to be mad or sick, is defined by a state apparatus or an institution that wants to normalize a formal identity for the human, the rational, the normal, whatever? And Deleuze and Guattari are hinging off of that to go against these ideas of normalcy and sanity and things like this, not to be stupidly contrarian, but to point out the fact that throughout history, ideas of normalcy and going with the flow of the masses have tended to accompany very dangerous reterritorializations, whereby a line of flight is drawn, such as with the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution. And then the subsequent reterritorialization of that revolutionary potential into Stalinist Russia, which was authoritarian and totalitarian, and it really didn't do as it was promised, per se, in, of course, bringing about a state, a socialist society. And Deleuze and Guattari are trying to figure out, okay, how is it that we can have a model for revolutionary action that's going to take account of the fact that there is this, I mean, even Hegel talks about this in the master-slave dialectic, of this constant fight to the death for recognition. We need ourselves to have an independent other to establish our existence, but we also need that other to be subservient to us such that they will bend down and recognize our existence. And Deleuze and Guattari are kind of just expanding on the master-slave dialectic, really, insofar as they're establishing a model for how it is that territory comes about. How is it that we have these formalized things like consciousness or the state that are going to allow for certain things to present themselves and others to not? Certain things to be normal, certain things to not be normal, certain things to go unrecognized, maybe, such as like systemic structural violence that is being covered up, like police brutality or government censorship or whatever it may be. And in terms of establishing how these formal systems come about, they want to talk about territory as a regime of signs, which is a really great way of putting it because it shows the cynicism that they have with regards to order. For Deleuze and Guattari, their system is very active, and it's about change and transience and becoming. And they say subjectification imposes on the line of flight a segmentarity that is forever repudiating that line, and upon absolute deterritorialization, a point of abolition that is forever blocking that deterritorialization or diverting it. The reason for this is simple. Forms of expression and regimes of signs are still strata, even considered in themselves after abstracting forms of content. Subjectification is no less a stratum than signifiance. And they're using this idea of subjectification to, it's similar to how they're talking about organization in Anti-Oedipus, in the sense of making something an organism, establishing organs. And they're trying to, they talk about the rhizome a lot in A Thousand Plateaus. They talk more about the body without organs in Anti-Oedipus as this plane of absolute deterritorialization, where flows intermingle in a non-hierarchical way, and creativity is so imminent that it is constantly actual on in the pure body of the earth, so to speak. And they want to talk about how exactly it is that that potential gets quelled and gets diverted down into specific channels of enunciation, of how exactly is it that I can be in society, in the family, in school, in academia, whatever it may be. There are definite lines which are drawn by a number of means, and there are a number of kind of canals that one can navigate down, and then there are others which are kind of taboo or outlawed, and to travel down those or to establish new paths is avant-garde or revolutionary. And they want to figure out, okay, we want revolution, and we want to figure out how can we get this to come about. And I mean, they even say that crazy talk is not enough. In each case, we must judge whether what we see is an adaptation of an old semiotic, a new variety of a particular mixed semiotic, or a process of creation of an as yet unknown regime. So they're like, look, not any action is going to be creative and new and allow for expression. Some forms of action and expression are going to fall into the singularity of the signifier. And the signifier is just basically going to be these structural elements that are defining what it is to be in a particular context. Maybe this is things like the king, or a particular religion, or certain institutions, certain senses of virtue. These are things that structure how exactly is it that we are permitted or not permitted to act in certain situations. And this really defines us humans, right? We exist in a certain cultural milieu, and there are certain canals down which one can travel, and others of which one cannot, at least without resistance. And in terms of figuring out how the body without organs, or the plane of consistency, gets stratified, gets subjectified, gets organized, they want to invoke particularly this idea of subjectification. And this is the process by which one is made a subject. Foucault has some interesting points on this when he talks about becoming a juridical subject, that is, a subject under the law. That to exist under the law, in some senses, one did not, before their birth, sign a contract stating their consent to the law. That's kind of a naive social contractarianism. Rather, we have been placed, almost pre-ontologically, in a state where there is order in some places, and normalcy is already actual or imminent. It is already present and something that we're within. And Deleuze and Guattari want to try to figure out how exactly is it that it was already there, and how is it that we can break out of it, knowing that any revolutionary change we make is going to be accompanied by reterritorialization. The Bolshevik Revolution, the deterritorialization of the Russian Revolution, is going to reterritorialize into various forms, one of which being Stalinist Russia, which was a particularly staunch regime of science. And subjectification is going to occur in which we start to orbit around, in kind of a solar system model, these signifiers which are defining what it is to be rational, what it is to be human, what it is to be masculine or feminine, what it is to be guilty, or whatever it may be. And for example, for Foucault, you are almost already guilty. For example, when you go into a court, when the judge asks you to pronounce your guilt, it's not so much you admitting that you were guilty as the judge telling you you're guilty and you accepting under the stringency of the situation in order to, maintain your well-being. Think about people who get these crazy sentences for very small amounts of marijuana, and you may ask, if you were in this situation, or one may ask, why is this something that's frowned upon? Why can't I, alcohol is equally, if not more harmful than marijuana in terms of the number of deaths that occur from drinking and driving, and the systemic impact it has on societies where alcoholism is very high. And one may ask, well, why is one thing like alcohol permitted and marijuana isn't? And Deleuze and Guattari want to figure that out, but they want to bring to the fore the idea that this order that one happens upon and that one is transmuted within is something that is imposed as a regime. And this regime that one falls into has a number of key structural elements which are defining what it is to be. And these are going to drive the process of subjectification. It's a pacification of revolutionary possibility in exchange for a sense of security, a sense of well-being and belonging. And they think that this is not too great. They want to talk about, for example, being a schizophrenic on a walk, and that is a better model for psychoanalysis than the analysand on the analyst's couch. And they think that these moments where these territories are established and subjectification occurs is actually not a good thing. They think it is going to quell our ability to be in touch with our relation to the earth and to other people, and it's going to isolate us, which I think is really interesting to see how this connects to modern society. And I think Jean Baudrillard does a wonderful job of explaining, the postmodern condition, kind of, as Jean-François Lyotard puts it, of this feeling of alienation that plenty of people feel today. We could chalk it up to, our isolation from each other with technology, which is kind of almost paradoxical, because we're almost closer to each other than we've ever been. Yet some people feel more isolated than they ever have. We are kind of put into this increasingly competitive workaholic mindset, especially in the West, and that takes a toll on people. And all these ways of being, being reduced to an employee, are going to be structured around things which subjectify one and take these lines of flight and they segment it up, they dice it up and put it into nice little pieces that can be processed by the system, and they block absolute deterritorialization in exchange for a form of creativity, of action that it's kind of like when Chomsky talks about creativity, Noam Chomsky, and nevertheless Chomsky insists on these very definite limitations on language that hinder our ability to go, to go beyond certain modes of expression. And Deleuze and Guattari are like, no, that's not creativity. That's just taking all of language and sending it into an orbital dynamic model around certain modes of proper speech, for example. And they want to say that forms of expression are determined by the milieu, by the assemblage one is within, by all the structural elements that are around you. These forms of expression are still stratified, which is to say they exhibit the twofold nature of tautology and reference to another part of the system. And let me explain that a little bit. And they talk about this in the Geology of Morals. Strata is this sort of binary way in which identity comes about in an assemblage. And strata, think of a geologic column. There are these layers that go horizontally in a geologic column that stack on top of one another, and each strata serves as a peristratum and a metastratum, or I'm not exactly sure the precise words, a substratum and a metastratum, that's the terms, for each other. Each stratum is stratified by its relation to other stratum. It is not just a stratum on its own, but rather it is a stratum in its relation to other stratum. So similar to how Hegel talks about, identity has to be tautological in a sense, but it also has to have reference to difference. Identity has to be this I am I, but exactly what that I is determined in relation to difference. And Hegel he reduces all of identity to a tautology effectively. But Deleuze and Guattari are trying to figure out, how is identity solely determined differentially? How is it that we can use multiplicity to be our true horizon for absolute deterritorialization? And thus, when we look at this first diagram, we'll kind of pick it apart by its 6 elements and explain how they're relating to the ways in which regimes of signs come about. Now, in the center here, we have the center or the signifier. This is the faciality of the god or the despot. And they use the term singularity more in Anti-Oedipus to talk about this, or the despotic signifier. This is that most central element, and of course any regime of signs is not just one diagram like this. It's a whole assemblage of concentric circles like this, where singularities have formed out of flows that create differential relations, and out of all these differences that occur, you get singularities. You get these central points which, think about the collection of matter in space. Matter congeals together through this haphazard relation of, matter in space, and it congeals together and it starts to have increasing gravitational intensity. And this gravitational intensity is going to cause things that draw near it to start to orbit around it closer and closer and closer, and eventually being absorbed into that body. And thus we get planets and stars and comets and, really any of these important cosmic bodies that we talk about. And thus, there is a method of capture in the singularity, in the center of any regime of signs, whereby the things that come to be related to it are not related to it non-hierarchically, but rather are moons, are comets, are insignificant, and are only identified in their relation to the center. So, for example, the moon can be seen as, because it orbits around the sun, and it does orbit around the sun, but orbits around the Earth, has a sort of negative quality to it, insofar as when we try to talk about the moon, we can say, well, it is an element of this system of the Earth, and it revolves around the Earth, and the Earth is kind of the center of things. Think of how this relates to like geocentrism, for example, when we see all these bodies, the heavenly bodies revolving around us, and we think, oh, we're the center. And it's very appealing. We can see how this appeals to the creation of totalitarian and fascist regimes, for example. These singularities form, and we start to get these very closely related orbits of sorts. And this brings us into the second part, which is the temple or palace with priests and bureaucrats. And this is basically just the rings that are starting to establish around the center or the signifier that are going to give things identity in relation to a center. And the third element gives us some interesting things, and it looks quite strange. I was not interpreting it like this, and I saw this model when I was flipping through the book, and I remember first seeing it and being like, man, that just like these make no sense. I'm excited to learn how they make sense, but it just makes no sense right now. And I was thinking this was some kind of, it's two triangles related to each other, kind of like a double pincer kind of action. But no, the fact that they're triangles is just happenstance. Number 3 is the organization in circles and the sign referring to other signs on the same circle or on different circles. So around the signifier, around the singularity, around this center, these concentric rings are going to form, and they have, of course, various relations to the intensity of the center. Think about orbital dynamics. The closer a body is to a significantly gravitationally intense mass, the faster it has to travel so as to not get sucked up into it. That's why Mercury travels so fast compared to Pluto, for example. And as these concentric rings form, they have various relations and various dependencies on the singularity. And as these rings establish, signs start to get established. And these signs are really just any entity that has identity. These are tables, chairs, people, books, practices. This could be anything. All of these are related. It should be fairly common sense to see to certain structural elements. There are key parts of what it is to be an American, for example. There's who's the president of the United States? Like, that's a big one. What is the makeup of the Supreme Court? That's a big one. What is the kind of prevailing political sentiment in our places of office? Things like this are very key structural elements. And as such, the signs that occur, that are allowed to occur, more specifically, around the signifier and create these concentric circles in this kind of orbital dynamic model, they're going to establish relations between each other. The phone is going to make a relation with the hand, and the pen is going to make a relation with the revolutionary poster, and the pillow is going to make a connection with the head. This is just fairly common sense. Just all sorts of different elements that exist in a society are going to interact with each other, and they're not always on the same. They are not always of the same valence, kind of. Like, you can have institutions interacting with toes or chairs or, just the most random things. These things that have very different intensities of relation to the signifier. The government apparatus has a lot more direct of a relation to these regimes of signs than do pillows, for example. And as such, this creates this structural field that defines the assemblage, that defines how is it that all these different elements interact in a society. And not just interact, but how are they allowed to interact in their relation to the singularity, the center, the signifier. And point number 4, the interpretive development of signifier into signified, which then reimparts signifier. And really, for me, this screams colonialism. They talk about throughout the fact that for territory to mean something, a territory has to expand. A territory, when it becomes self-sufficient, quickly becomes impotent and it becomes overthrown. A regime that does not have an active, if not parasitic, relationship to other localities is going to tend towards its destruction. It's going to tend towards political, it's going to devolve politically. And as such, it needs to proliferate outwards, and this is epitomized by colonialism. There is the need to, for example, in capitalism, which is defined by capital as the signifier, as the relation things have to profit and their existence. Their existence as a sign is as a commodity sign, right? Just basic Marx stuff. This proliferation is going to be the way in which a regime sustains itself. It's going to be the way in which settler colonialism is able to keep its centralized regimes alive by having labor from Africa in the form of slaves. It's going to help establish political interests overseas, as we see today with the U.S. in the Middle East. And, I mean, not just the U.S., of course, but I think the U.S. is just a particular culprit of that. But this could take a number of different ways of showing itself. But the important thing to note is that anything that starts to establish dominance is going to have to expand. It's going to have to develop and impart the signifier on things and make them a signified and collect them. And thus, these circles, these concentric circles, expand. This solar system gets bigger. Think of the gradation of, for example, you have a very small body, like a comet is probably not going to get much orbiting around it. It might get like little tiny particles, little pieces of mineral. And then you've got a planet is going to have moons and things like that. And then you've got large stars, which are going to have whole solar systems around them. And then you're going to have black holes, which are going to have whole galaxies around them. And this is kind of that expanding circle, sort of concentric circle, solar system model. And solar system model is not the word they use. That's just the word that I think kind of best exemplifies this. And then as these expand, we move into number 5, which is the expiatory animal, the blocking of the line of flight. So those are two kind of parts. We have the expiatory animal. This is that line of flight. It's a moment of deterritorialization where a active relationship of becoming is established with the earth, with ancestors, which are worshipped in ancestor worship. All of these different things which, for example, the nomad is going to partake in. But it is going to be blocked. And this is that problem with subjectification they talked about before. That subjectification is going to neutralize lines of flight and cut them off, and it's going to segment them, and that leads into the scapegoat, or the negative sign of the line of flight. So any moment of deterritorialization is going to be turned into a scapegoat. It's going to be neutralized such that it's a line of flight. It's a relative deterritorialization. You know, it upsets things, but as they say before in kind of maybe 20 or 30 pages earlier, that you're allowed to have agency in society as long as you don't change things, basically. Like you can be present in this order as long as you don't actually upset the order enough to change it. And Deleuze and Guattari are trying to figure, okay, well, how can we do that? How can we engage in these subaltern strategies? How can we be revolutionary when it seems that we have this problem, which is that everything that exists is going to be structured. It's going to have relation to other entities, and some of these entities are going to have more gravitational intensity, so to speak, than others. Some are going to absorb others faster and with more intensity than others. And this is kind of Baudrillard's thing, is, well, we've gotten to such a point that we're not going to be able to account for, we're no longer able to produce, but rather we are reproducing these models that occur by the overcoding of the code. And of course, Baudrillard talks about how dangerous this is and how we try to expiate and absorb death in a way that kind of makes us act in a dead manner. But Baudrillard's point is kind of, well, in Deleuzian and Guattarian language, that every moment of deterritorialization is always going to be relative deterritorialization. There is no absolute line of flight, so to speak. There is no genuine creativity that can escape the model of the system. They lay this out a little bit more clearly and with some more depth in this second picture that they have here. And we see the same expanding circle model. We have the singularity, and we have these well, we can almost think of these as energy levels around atoms, right? And these electrons will exist on certain energy levels, and this will define the ways in which they can establish differential relations. But point number 1 on here is the point of subjectification. We can see it is occurring right when this line of flight is happening. And they talk about a line of flight as being sort of a tangent line. We can see on the diagram that we've been traveling in circles, and all of a sudden it's like gravity. I mean, if we imagine a particle kind of going from the centermost point and emanating outwards in these circles, we can see that at the point of subjectification, this is that point of deterritorialization, and it is going off on a tangent line, right? It's like gravity has almost stopped working, and it's just flying off in a straight line now. Now, they don't draw a perfectly straight line, but you get the idea. At this point of subjectification, they point out that it is the replacing of the center of signifiance, which is to say that whenever these points of deterritorialization occur, they act as a new singularity, as a new center, insofar as they are defined as, another sign, another structural point on this solar system model. And like we talked about before, it is neutralized through subjectification. The point of subjectivity is coded by this center of signifiance, and thus it really just serves to mobilize the strategies of the regime of signs, so to speak. So this is the way in which revolution is overcoded by a regime of signs. And we can see that point number 2 is the two faces turned away from each other. This is what I talked about before, part of it being tautology and part of it pointing to differential relations. This is the double pincer action of stratum. This point of subjectification is going to testify to itself as an absolute point, so to speak, as something that exists in and of itself. But also, it is necessarily going to relay and refer to other things. Hegel says this in the master-slave dialectic, that for something to exist, it can't just exist on its own. Solipsism is not going to work. Things have to have differential relations, and thus Hegel thinks that terms like being are naturally going to self-sublate into non-being and create a dialectic, and then his whole system is going to, start chugging along. And really, this is the self-sublation of the point of subjectification. It's going to necessarily establish connections with other points and also have a relation as a point in and of itself. And this point that it relates to is number 3, the subject of enunciation resulting from the point of subjectification and the turning away. So this point of subjectification, this is kind of the moment of capture, so to speak, whereby a point of creativity is established. A line of flight is being followed. And at that moment, think about a perfectly unitary system like, a repeating line of ones. And it's just a string of ones. This is kind of the way in which the regime of signs works. It overcodes everything into merely this monistic emanation, right? It's all being, it's all substance, it's whatever it may be. It's all reduced to the one or Geist or whatever. But then, let's say we change one of those ones to a 0. Oh, this is a line of flight. This is something different from the order. But at that very moment, it becomes instantly recognizable and localizable where exactly a point of differentiation is occurring, and that acts as a point of subjectification. This is one of the, kind of to use Baudrillard's word, it's one of the fatal strategies of the regime of signs. That it is going to be able to, because it is so structurally dense and has developed to such a point, it's going to be able to locate points of deterritorialization and say, nope, neutralize. This is now a point of subjectification, and this is going to serve our regime. And we may ask, well, how does it serve it? And that is by eliciting, in targeting this point of subjectification, it is going to elicit and define a subject of enunciation. It's going to define you as a juridical subject, as a man, as a woman, as a member of a family or tribe or something like this. It's going to necessarily entail that a variability inherent in expression is going to be tamed and going to be subverted for the benefit of a regime of signs. It's going to neutralize you and turn you into a subject of enunciation. And point number 4, we see where they have this little skipping action going on. Point number 4 is the subject of the statement, into which the subject of enunciation recoils. So whenever a statement is occurring, or rather a subject of enunciation enunciates, he necessarily points to some subject of his statement, right? He establishes a relation between him and something else. When I talk about a book, I necessarily, as a subject of enunciation, establish a relation to that book. And this is the way in which the regime of signs establishes new connections and expands itself. This is the way in which colonialism, read Orientalism and see the ways in which things like academic disciplines and stereotypes are, these things that almost define how it is that we see other people and how we act ourselves are actually ways of bending to the will of power, so to speak. So this subject of the statement is necessarily elicited by the appearance of the subject of enunciation. The subject of enunciation is going to be compelled to speak and act in a certain way. There are going to be, because, everyone is going to be oriented towards action. Without action, you're dead. You cease to be without change. And the regime of signs is basically going to kind of quell the multivariate ways in which you can express yourself and say, okay, you can go down these definite channels in which we're going to define you as a subject of enunciation by subjectifying you, and then you are going to elicit a relation, a determinate relation to the subject of your enunciation, which is going to allow the regime of signs to expand itself. And the dotted line, point number 5, this is the succession of finite linear proceedings accompanied by a new form of priest and a new bureaucracy. So this is the ways, like I said, in which the regime of signs is going to proliferate itself and expand. In the subject of enunciation, linking itself to a subject of the statement, of the enunciation, that thing in which the connection is related to, that is going to allow for the regime to expand. Think about the ways in which, for example, the Crusades occurred. And there was this dispersion of Christianity and of Catholicism, and not to say that they're necessarily different, but just to be more specific. And in doing so, this was a way in which, for example, the soldiers were defined by their point of subjectification under the power of God, right? Or under the power of the state. And the two faces established here is necessarily going to mean, okay, I get to be a subject. This is the great thing about subjectification, is I get to be a subject. And Deleuze and Guattari are like, no, it means you get turned into a subject, which necessarily establishes you as, point number 3, that subject of enunciation, as a child of God, as a fighter for the homeland, or whatever it may be, or a slayer of infidels, or whatever it may be. And this will establish relations with Jews, Muslims, all number of people as the Crusades expanded themselves and thus expanded the territory of the empires they represented. And this allows for point number 5, this relation to establish between subjects which are part of the regime of signs and the things outside of the regime of signs, which come to be defined insofar as they are elicited by the regime, insofar as the regime is compelled to expand. Thus, new forms of priesthood and bureaucracy establish. And then point number, because you can see that that repeats itself over and over. That's the sort of infinite expanse of, this is exactly how a line of flight is restricted. This is how creativity is minimalized and neutralized in a regime of signs. And with point number 6, with the line of flight, it is freed, but it's still segmented. It remains negative and blocked. And this is to say that the line of flight it's shot through by restrictions and impositions of, okay, this is the moment where we're going to make you feel like you can make some change, but actually it's change that we define on our terms. And we can see this process going on ad infinitum. And the appearance of this line of flight, it's a relative deterritorialization. It's not genuine creativity, but rather it is compelled creativity, which has a determinate relation to the regime of signs. Now, this allows us to connect so many things, because we can now establish the relation between capitalism and schizophrenia, and we can go back and look at this model from Anti-Oedipus on page 282 of kind of your standard, the penguin one that everyone has. And it just looks so strange when you look at it. You're just like, what is this? Paranoia, schizophrenia, the despotic body, the molar and molecular, like, what is going on here? And it is important to note that when we looked at the way that the regime of signs works, we can think of the singularity, for example, as being capital. And thus, this expanding circle is going to cross new thresholds. It's going to make new connections. But as we can see, any new connection that's made as a subject, or just as anything, is reduced to a subject. That moment of deterritorialization necessarily is accompanied by, because of something's relation to the center, to a reterritorialization, to an apparatus of capture, which is the regime of signs. And thus, the big difference in strategy between capitalism and schizophrenia is that capitalism is going to engage in this proliferation where it's going to expand itself via the increasing extraction of surplus value and via colonial rule and things like this, and via exporting of labor to poor countries where you don't have to worry about labor laws. Capitalism is going to engage in these lines of flight, but they're always neutralized lines of flight. This is relative deterritorialization, is what they call it. And this, on this model, is paranoia. We can see that there is a trajectory down the center of the model, which is cutting through these planes of the body of the earth, the despotic body, the body of capital, the molar aggregates and the molecular elements. So these horizontal things, these are kind of the plane of consistency, so to speak. It's that area on which and through which change occurs. And we can see it going in two directions. And this left side of paranoia is capitalism. So it is going to, yes, it is going to be creative. It's going to allow for innovation and allow for change and allow for us to come out with all sorts of new ways to, win the space race or whatever it is. But all these moments of creativity are not absolute deterritorializations, but rather they are neutralized forms of creativity insofar as they are restricted to their relation to the singularity, the center, the signifier that is capital, that is going to define everything in this increasingly dense solar system model. And thus, capitalism is going to tend towards these molar aggregates. And that molar aggregate is this solar system model. It's this intensive accumulation. It's almost a sickening sort of accumulation of just infinite accumulation. People talk about all the time today about, everyone's just so materialistic. They just want to buy, and they can't be happy. And it's like, yes, that's exactly how capitalism is going to work, because it's going to be this endless proliferation of never being satisfied. I mean, we can think of capitalism itself as almost having intentions, that it intends to expand because it's never happy. It's a sort of coping mechanism of sorts. Whereas schizophrenia is going to engage in lines of flight. It's going to follow these lines of flight. It's going to be engaged in deterritorialization. And it's going to go through the body of the earth, the despotic body, the body of capital. But it's going to do this in a rhizomatic way, which follows molecular elements. And what this means is that rather than focusing on these large, intensive accumulations and aggregates of territory, it's going to focus on these small little moments of subaltern strategy, of these little moments that cannot be accounted for in the system of capital, for example, without leaving their mark. And that is how Deleuze and Guattari, and even Homi Bhabha does this too, are going to get out of Baudrillard's problem of the terror of the code, so to speak. Deleuze and Guattari say that the code cannot account for all moments of change, because any code is going to be defined by an outside which it is not. It is going to have a differential relation to things which it must subdue via a regime of science in order to establish subjecthood and dominance, but there are always going to be points which cannot be established. And this is the difference between linearity and kind of polyvocality that they talk about. Capitalism and the regime of science is going to follow a linear order. Like we showed in the solar system model, it is this linear expansion outward of territory whereby these successive circles are drawn around each other, and it's always continuous. Now, if we look at this model, we see something special, is that we have, the body of the earth, we have the despotic body running horizontally. But perpendicular to those horizontal lines is the trajectory of both capitalism and schizophrenia. So they're putting capitalism and schizophrenia dangerously close together here, but they want to show how their strategies are different, how their methods of action are oriented in very different ways. Capitalism towards molar aggregates, towards treating deterritorialization and creativity as negative, whereas schizophrenia is going to look at these molecular elements and these rhizomatic forms of action, that both of which are going to be superlinear, so to speak. They are going to be polyvocal. They are going to escape the linearity of this expansion and suddenly go perpendicular. They're not going to be parallel like we like we saw in the first diagram, at that moment of deterritorialization, it was stratified. There was a solid line and a dotted line, and that's because stratification always comes in twos. And their point is that capitalism and schizophrenia both have this ability to deterritorialize and to break the linearity of the system, so to speak. But capitalism is just going to do it to establish the same system, the same rule of capital, whereas schizophrenia is going to engage in creativity simply to be a member of a process of becoming, to be an intensity, a multiplicitous intensity. So I hope this has given you some help on thinking about these concepts, on situating these diagrams, and thinking about how it is that we function in these collective assemblages. I'll see you in another lecture.